Okay, here we go. Chapter 2, The Beginnings of English America. Before we jump into the chapter, though, on this first one, I want to talk a little bit about how these video assignments are going to work, and also talk a bit about how to read a textbook chapter. The videos are going to run about 30 minutes, sometimes a little bit more, might be a little bit more this time. And there'll be questions, usually about 5 questions that are embedded that I'll ask during the course of the video that will become your assignment. You pause the video or however you want to do it and answer the questions. There should be about 2 or 3 pages of answers to, if you're going to do single space, probably a couple pages. Turn it in at the next class period. But the videos are a chance for you to, for me at least, to talk about certain themes that I really want you to focus on in the chapter, and to get you thinking in certain ways about some of the ideas that are presented. But before we get into chapter 2, I do want to talk a bit broadly about what you do with a textbook chapter, right? I mean, textbooks are notorious. Everybody hates textbooks. Historians love to bash textbooks. I'm not a textbook basher because I know how hard it is to write a textbook. I've never written one, but I know people who have, and it's a tremendous amount of labor. It's tremendously difficult, but it's also tremendously important because it's important for us to have a sweeping narrative of our time, right? I mean, these survey courses obviously cover too much time and too much material, and it's impossible to remember it all. And that's okay. Don't worry. Nobody remembers it all. Eric Foner himself doesn't remember it all. I certainly don't remember it all. But it's important to have a sweeping narrative that can highlight grand themes, and that's one of the first things that I want you to think about is to, as you're approaching this textbook chapters, not to try to remember everything, but to think about these broad themes. For Eric Foner, one of the main themes that he's going to be writing about and that we're going to be talking about this semester is freedom. It's a driving force in American history. It's fundamental to our national culture, as much today as it was 400 years ago. And so we're going to talk a lot about freedom, as well as its opposite, slavery, right? So the themes of freedom and slavery, power and powerlessness are going to crop up over and over. And it's one of the things that you're going to want to think about. How do these people, whether it's a Roger Williams or an Anne Hutchinson or an African slave, how do these people fit into this larger framework of freedom and slavery? Another theme is change and continuity, right? What things are changing over time? What things are the same? What seeds are planted early during this colonial period that are then going to develop and blossom later? Right? You're going to want to think about how things have and have not changed over time. How definitions and conceptions of freedom change and do not change over time. Right? So keeping in mind these themes will help you not get overwhelmed. Right? Because this textbook and any textbook can be overwhelming. There's just too much stuff in here. So step back, think broadly about patterns and the stories and the narrative of American history, rather than focusing in on just trying to remember all the facts. Second thing about reading this book, and any book really, is that reading is not a spectator sport, right? You've got to be active. You've got to be involved. I highly encourage you. I know some folks want to resell their books, but I highly encourage you to underline, to highlight, to scribble notes in the margin, to do things to help you remember. Take notes, help you remember what you're reading as you're reading it, right? Because it's far too easy to just kind of look at the pages and all the words start to blend together and one page looks just like the next. By highlighting, by taking notes, by scribbling notes in the margin, even if you never go back to those notes, that process helps you retain the information, helps you remember what you're reading, right? By giving you a sense of ownership, right? When you highlight, you're taking ownership of that page. You're saying, well, this is what I think is important, or here's something that I want to focus on, right? So that engagement, that action is really important to learning. So I highly encourage you to do that. And lastly is to look for clues, right? The historian wants you to understand what he or she is writing. Right? In this case, Eric Foner wants you to understand his ideas about freedom. He wants you to think about things in a certain way. And so he's going to give you clues. And the clues come in the title, the subheadings, right? The headings and subheadings that go on throughout, the maps and the images. Historians take a lot of time to choose particular images to convey certain messages and to help you visualize what they're writing. So take time to look at those maps, study those maps, understand how they fit into the story. Look at the pictures, right? Some of them are fascinating, and that's really what I do if I'm about to start a chapter. I'm not going to just start on page 1 and march all the way through to the end, right? I'm going to look at the headings. I'm going to read the introduction very carefully, and I'm going to skip ahead to the conclusion. And I'm going to look at the headings and subheadings. I'm going to read some of the pictures, captions, and look at the maps. All of that is a way to get a kind of a sneak preview before I start the actual reading, because then things will have a certain structure. There'll be a little familiarity with the material before I get started. And that's what I'm going to do with you right now, right? First thing I'm going to do is start with the title and just kind of look at some of the headings, and then we'll go back and do the introduction and the conclusion, just so that we get a sense of what this chapter is about before we dig in. First of all, I look at chapter 2, Beginnings of English America, and that in itself is a choice, right? Every historian has an interpretation, right? This isn't the truth. Right? This isn't handed down by God as the way things happen. This is the way Eric Foner interprets this period of American history. If you were to read another book, I've got another textbook here, Created Equal. It's a great one. I almost chose this one for our class. Their chapter 2 is very different, right? They don't focus just on the English. They look at all the European countries together in their founding efforts. So by choosing English America, choosing to focus on English America, Eric Foner is staking claim to a particular interpretation. He's doing this because he thinks that English America, that the roots of our understanding of freedom and the roots of who we are as a country go back primarily to English North America, not solely. Right? It's not certainly the only important development or the only important colonization effort, but this is what he thinks is most important. That's why he's going to focus solely on English America in chapter 2. Now, you can argue with that, right? And I actively encourage you to question what you read and ask questions as you read, right? You may think English America is only part of the story. What about the Spanish? What about the French? What about the Dutch, especially here in New England, right? And so you should feel free to question Eric Foner as you go along and to ask questions as you go along. So we're going to look quickly at some of the headings, like England in the New World. So this section, all right, he's going to go back to England, right, unifying the English nation, England and Ireland. He's going back to what became called the Old World, back to the home front, and really trying to get a sense of why people are coming here, right? Spreading Protestantism is another subheading, motives for colonization. This section of the chapter is going to help us understand what is pulling people to North America, and what is pushing people away from England as well, because there are always pull and push forces when it comes to immigration. You've got the social crisis back in England and masterless men. I want to talk a bit more about that section. So this first section is about what's going on back home that's bringing people here to America. Then we have the coming of the English. All right, so they arrive. Who are these people, these English immigrants? Then we have a section on indentured servants. Land and liberty. This is fundamental because land and liberty are so closely intertwined. Englishmen and Indians. Of course, this place isn't empty. There are thousands and thousands of Indians, of people living on this land that the English are arriving in. How do they interact? The transformation of Indian life, changes in the land, what's going on the ground. So that section tells us broadly about what's happening when the English arrive. Then we move south. We move to the Chesapeake, settling the Chesapeake, Jamestown colony, a lot of the challenges that the colonists faced there. From company to society, moving from the Virginia Company, which was a purely profit-seeking venture with just men involved, to a society. It becomes a self-sustaining settlement. Powhatan and Pocahontas, some of the Indians that they confront, the uprising of 1622, right? You're starting to have conflicts very early on over the land, right? The English are settling on Indian land, and that's going to create all kinds of problems. A tobacco colony, women in the family, how Jamestown grows and develops and sustains itself over time. The Maryland experiment, religion in Maryland, what's going on a little bit further to the north, a very different kind of colony that develops. So that section is all about the Chesapeake and how the Chesapeake develops, and it's going to develop in a very different kind of way. And we have the New England way with the rise of Puritanism. Right? People are coming to New England for very different reasons than they came to the Chesapeake. Moral liberty, right? Again, liberty. Foner's going to talk a lot about liberty and freedom, how people understand what it means to be free. Puritans had a very distinctive approach to freedom, conception of freedom. They did want freedom of worship for themselves, right? But that doesn't mean that they had the same understanding of freedom of worship that we might have today. In fact, it was very different. Pilgrims at Plymouth, of course, those are the famous stories from Thanksgiving. The Great Migration, how migration was so strong in the early 1600s for several decades. The Puritan family, how does a society sustain itself? Government and society, Puritan liberties. So that section's all about the development of the New England colonies. Then we get to New Englanders divided, right? Conflicts within New England society. You've got Roger Williams and Hutchinson, who are taking a very different interpretation of religion than the Puritans originally envisioned. And so they get excommunicated, so to speak. They get sent away from the society because their understanding of freedom was very different than the Puritan leaders' understanding of freedom. Then you've got Puritans and Indians. How do they interact? The Pequot War. Problems erupt, right? The merchant elite, the halfway covenant. How do people in New England figure out what to do with the next generation? How do they sustain themselves? What happens when young people grow up and want their own land? So that whole section is about a lot of the challenges, the conflicts going on within New England. And the last section is about religion, politics, and freedom. And again, this is a way that your book that you're reading is very different from other textbooks. Part of why I chose this particular book, because I share Eric Foner's passion about freedom. I share his understanding of freedom as being fundamental to American culture and to the development of the American nation. And so understanding where those roots of freedom come from, I think, is tremendously important. And he's going to talk a little bit about that here. You know, the rights of Englishmen, the English Civil War in the mid-1600s, and England's own debate over freedom, which the immigrants to America brought with them to this country. And this idea of English liberty, because this becomes these become the seeds of what grows into American culture, American freedom. The Civil War in English America, the crisis in Maryland, and finally Cromwell and the Empire. So you'll see a lot of this chapter has to do with England as much as it does about any new colonies, right? Because we have to understand that the background and the experiences of the people who are coming here in order to understand how the societies take root. Okay, so we kind of just did a real quick, brief look at the headings and the subheadings of the chapter. I'm going to go back and look at the introduction now. because the introduction is something you should read and reread, because this is where he prepares you for the chapter. So he starts here on page 45, 1607, with the voyages to what becomes Jamestown, along the James River in Virginia. I think what he points out, what is very interesting, is that this is not a government enterprise, right? It's not like Queen Elizabeth says, okay, you are going under the auspices of the English government and the English crown. You are being paid for by the English people. Go forth and spread glory to England. No, it's done by a company. Queen Elizabeth has too much going on. She's worried about Spain and France and all the machinations of European politics. She doesn't know what's going on in North America. No one knows what's going to happen in North America. She doesn't want to sink her national treasure into a voyage of uncertain prospects. She supports them, she encourages them, but she's not going to financially back them. So they form a company, this Virginia company, and bring together all kinds of people, including members of Parliament, who do think that there are riches to be made in the New World, and they set forth. And initially, it is just about finding riches and bringing them back home to England. Right? It's all men. They leave 100 men behind. They're like, all right, go find the gold, find the silver, find what you can, and we'll bring it back. Initially, they didn't have an intention of creating a permanent settlement that they would live in, right? A colony that they would live in. This changes over time, and what happens in Jamestown is happening at the beginning of the 17th century, and it's part of this European power politics, right? Because whoever can control North America and what people hope is going to be, a rich area to exploit, whoever can control that is obviously going to wield much more power back home in Europe. And so you've got the French coming in to what's now Canada, you've got the Spanish coming in to what's now Central America, you've got the Dutch coming in to what's now New York. Everybody wants a piece of this pie, right? And so the development, the settlement, the European settlement of America, it happens from many different directions all at once, right? And he talks about that, right? And at the end of the second full paragraph here, it occurred from many directions at once, from east to west at the Atlantic coast, north to south along the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers, and south to north in what is now the American Southwest. Right? And so if we're living in California or Arizona and New Mexico, we may want to take a slightly different approach to understand how our culture, how our society came to be, right? Because there's so much more Spanish influence in that area. Whereas in New England, it's much more of an east to west narrative. Now, what he's going to talk about in this chapter, is in this next paragraph, right? Why people are coming. English in North America in the 17th century was a place where entrepreneurs sought to make fortunes. Right? So you got the economic motivations, still a driving force of immigration. Religious minorities hoped to worship without governmental interference and to create societies based on biblical teaching. So religious freedom was fundamental. And aristocrats dreamed of recreating a vanished world of feudalism. So these are different motivations that people had for why they're coming here. Different English people had for why they're coming here. And John Smith has a great quote to the middle of this paragraph, right? No man will go from England to have less freedom in America. No man's going to come to America to enjoy less freedom. Right? They're going to come here with the hope of having more freedom for themselves, more economic opportunity and more freedom. And these two pieces go together. They're almost inseparable in the minds of the English settlers. Right? In order to have freedom, you have to have economic opportunity. You have to have economic independence. And he sums it all up. Foner sums it all up on page 47, right? In this last paragraph. Many degrees of freedom coexisted in 17th century North America. That's fundamental, right? Is that it's not like everybody's enjoying the same kind of freedom. There are different degrees of freedom. From the slave, stripped completely of liberty, to the independent landowner, who enjoyed a full range of rights, to lots of places in between, right? During the lifetime person might well occupy more than one place on the spectrum, including African Americans. Not all African Americans were slaves. Some were indentured servants. Some were free landowners. Right? There was a spectrum of freedom here. The settlers' success, however, it rested on depriving Native Americans of their land and, in some colonies, on importing large numbers of African slaves as laborers. Freedom and lack of freedom expanded together in the 17th century America. And that's crucial to your understanding of how America developed in the centuries before the American Civil War. Freedom and the lack of freedom expand together. You might think, well, they're diametrically opposed. So as freedom grows, lack of freedom will decrease, but it doesn't happen that way. As freedom expands, so too does lack of freedom. As English colonists and later Americans enjoy more and more rights, African Americans enjoy fewer and fewer rights. So and Native Americans certainly lose out tremendously. So you have freedom and lack of freedom expanding together simultaneously in 17th century America. Okay, so that's the introductions. That gives you a framework in which to understand this chapter. And now let's flip and let's look at page 86. Just look quickly at his conclusion. And Foner's not a man for grand conclusions. He's just going to sum it up really quickly in one paragraph at the bottom of page 86, second to last paragraph. Thus, by the middle of the 17th century, several English colonies existed along the Atlantic coast of North America. Established as part of an ad hoc process rather than arising under any coherent national plan, they differed enormously in economic, political, and social structure. Right? So the English didn't have a plan. It's not like they came here with a strategic vision, right, with a blueprint for how this is going to all shape out. It's not like Queen Elizabeth knew exactly how this was going to work, because no one knew what was going on in North America. No one knew what these settlements would look like or how the interactions with the Indians were going to go. No one knew if this was going to be a profitable venture or not. So it was a series of adjustments. It grows in an ad hoc way. The seeds had been planted in the Chesapeake for the development of plantation societies based on unfree labor, and in New England for settlements centered on small towns and family farms. Now, this is absolutely fundamental to the development of American history, right? Because 200 years later, these seeds have grown up, and this is why we have a civil war, right? We have very different societies emerging out of this development process, and ultimately these societies are not going to be able to coexist by the mid-1800s, and that's where we get our Civil War. But the seeds of that Civil War in some ways are planted from the very, very beginning, right here in chapter 2. Throughout the colonies, many residents enjoyed freedoms they had not possessed at home, especially access to land and the right to worship as they desired. Others found themselves confined to unfree labor for many years or an entire lifetime. Again, this development of freedom and lack of freedom at the same time, growing simultaneously. Okay, so now we have a sense of what the chapter's about, what are the main themes that Foner's going to be writing about, and so now we can go back and kind of talk about some of the, I want to highlight a few of the key sections that I want you to look closely at. First of all, I want you to look at this idea of masterless men on page 52, right? And it's this idea of economic dependence as being a form of servitude, right? That what the ideal was masterless men, right? That you didn't want to have to depend on anyone else for your living, right? And this even extends to wage labor, right? If you have to depend on a boss to pay you wages, well, that's just another form of servitude. Not quite slavery, but almost, right? Because you are not a free man. So it was this idea of having your own land, having your own trade, doing your own thing. Economic independence was at the root of their conception of freedom. right? And so in the second paragraph, you have the image of the New World as a unique place of opportunity where the English laboring classes could regain economic independence by acquiring land, and where even criminals would enjoy a second chance, was deeply rooted from the earliest days of settlement, right? I mean, and what is America, right? The land of opportunity. I mean, this is still a driving force for immigrants from today from Somalia or from Mexico or from Southeast Asia who come here seeking economic opportunity. This is what drove the English laboring classes, right? Because it's the poor by and large who come to settle this area. Why? Because they're the ones willing to take the risks to come here. This is a tremendous risk to leave everything that they've known for a place that we didn't have Google Maps. We knew nothing about this area, right? And they take this risk because they're seeking economic independence. They don't want to be wage slaves back home, right? And so a lot of what's going on back at home, there are all these the social crisis, the enclosure movement that you've read about, where English people are losing their land. They're being forced into these cities. They're working in these factories for wages. This is not what they can think of as freedom. They're looking for new opportunity. These masterless men, that's what they want. They don't want a master. They want to have their own land. They want to have a chance to pursue their own trade. They want to be free, and that's what's driving. Part of what's driving English settlement in North America. So that's your first question. It's just to explain what masterless men are and how this idea of masterless men drives English settlement in North America. So you can pause, write your answer, or write down the question. What were masterless men, this idea of masterless men, and how did the idea of masterless men influence the development of English North America? Next, I want to turn to flipping the page over to page 54. We have this small passage which is tremendously important on land and liberty, because these two things are critical. They're inseparable, right? Access to land played many roles in 17th century America. Land, English settlers believed, was the basis of liberty. If you did not own your land, you were not a free man, right? And freedom at this time was really focused on men. Women were in a completely different category. But if you did not own land, you could not be free, right? Because you were going to be dependent on someone else in order to survive, right? Owning land gave men control over their own labor and, in most colonies, the right to vote. Skipping over to the next paragraph, land was a source of wealth and power for colonial officials and their favorites, who acquired enormous estates. Without labor, however, land would have little value. Since immigrants did not come to America intending to work the land of others, right? They wanted to be masterless men. They came here to get their own land, to acquire their own land, not to work on somebody else's land. So since they didn't want to work on anybody else's land, except maybe temporarily in the case of indentured servants, the very abundance of quote-unquote free land eventually led many property owners to turn to slaves as a workforce, right? Because if you have thousands of acres of land, there's no way that one person, one family, can work all that land. So if you want to turn that massive estate into something productive, something to generate wealth, you need labor to do it. Well, if these English laborers are coming over here saying, I want to be a masterless man, right? I don't want a master. I want to do my own land. I want to work my own land. I want to acquire my own land and be free. Well, they've got to find someone else to work that land. And that's going to lead eventually to the development of race-based slavery in this country. So that's a key point to remember. Land and liberty go hand in hand for Englishmen in North America. Now, I want to flip over to page 63, because related to that, I want you to look at this picture. And this is going to be the second question, right? Remember what we did in class where you analyze this picture? I want you to describe what you see in this picture. We have a caption to give you a little sense of what's going on, but describe what you see in this picture. What does this picture tell you about life in the Chesapeake colony? So describe what you see and what this tells you about life in the Chesapeake colonies. Because life in the Chesapeake colonies, in a tobacco colony, is going to be very, very different than life in New England. So that's your second question. Next, I want you to flip over to page 68. There's this fantastic seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company, right? These companies were basically booster organizations trying to bring, almost like tourist organizations, or trying to bring immigrants over to the New World, right? And so, again, I want you to describe what you see here in this seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And what does this tell you about how the English thought about the colonization of North America? And I just want you to write, well, what do you think of this seal? When you look at it and you read the caption and you think about the role of this kind of advertisement in the colonization effort, what do you think of it? Write your opinions down. Now, I want to flip over to one last section that I want to talk about, which is about the levelers and the English Civil War. So this is at the end of page 83 and 84, right? And so the English have their own Civil War. You know, if you study English history, their Civil War is in the mid-1600s instead of the mid-1800s, like ours is. But this part of what's going on in England is that there's this debate over freedom, and you get these people called the levelers. And the levelers are fascinating because they're really the first small d democratic political movement, meaning they're the first people to say, wait a minute, the rights that the rich people enjoy, they should be our rights too, right? That rights shouldn't be based just on where you were born or how much money you have, right? And so there's one fantastic quote by Thomas Rainsborough: "The poorest he that lives in England hath a life to live as the greatest he." Right? That poor people have the same right to life and liberty that rich people do. I mean, this is radical. I mean, this is profound. This is also something the English authorities are not particularly interested in the mid-1600s. Right? So flipping over to page 84, the levelers offered a glimpse of the modern definition of freedom as a universal entitlement in a society based on equal rights, not a function of social class. Another new group, the Diggers, went even further, hoping to give freedom an economic underpinning through the common ownership of land. Right? So the levelers and the Diggers are thinking in new ways about freedom. And they never take power. They don't take power in England. They never did. England is still a very class-based society. But they're advocating new ideas and planting seeds in the minds of people in England. Many of these people are poor or working class people who then migrate to this country. And they bring those ideas with them. They're not going to flourish for decades, for more than a century. But this idea that freedom should not be reserved for the upper class is fundamental to our society. It's fundamental to any small d democratic movement, right? A movement toward a society based on equal rights for all people in the society. And so that's your fourth question now, is why were the levelers so important to the development of freedom in America? Who were the levelers and why were they so important to the development of freedom in America? So explain that for yourself in your own words. Of course, as you're answering these questions, you're not just going to take what the book says, what Eric Foner says. You don't want to just take what I say. You want to take what Foner says, take what I say, mix it up in your mind, add your own perspective, your own analysis, your own interpretation, and put it down for yourself. That's the process of learning how to think critically and learning how to think for yourself. So there are the four main questions. The last question I would have is a question I'll often ask this semester, and that is, what surprised you the most about what you read? Was there something that you were going along, you were reading, you're like, whoa, I never knew that, or I hadn't thought about it that way before, right? If you're thinking actively, if you're engaged in the material, there are going to be lots of things that surprise you. I'll tell you, again, I've read lots of textbooks. I've read lots of chapters about English North America. I'll still find something. When I reread that chapter, I'll still find something I hadn't really thought about in a particular way before. Because whenever you read something new, it's like, when you watch a movie for a second time, you see things you've never seen before. You're constantly learning new things. Or because you see things from your own perspective, and so as your experience changes, you're going to learn and see new things as well. So that's question number 5, and it's what surprised you most about what you read. Good luck, and now we're on to Richard Hakluyt and his efforts to bring more people to the New World.